The storm rolled in just before sundown, black clouds crawling over the Texas plains like bruises spreading across the sky. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the Haskins farm, lifting dust and shredded feed sacks from the ground, slapping them against the fence posts like ghosts of all that used to grow there. In the yard, the rain began to fall, first a drizzle, then a cold, merciless downpour. And in that rain lay Clara May Haskins, broken and bleeding, one arm twisted beneath her, the taste of blood thick on her tongue. She didn't remember falling. She remembered only the shouting, the words that cut deeper than the blows. 3 girls! Earl had roared, his face red and his breath reeking of whiskey. 3 useless mouths! You can't even give me a son. What kind of woman are you? She remembered the sound of her baby crying in the cradle, the older girl screaming as he'd shoved her out the door, and then the flash of pain when his hand caught her cheek again and again until her legs gave way. Then nothing, only rain. Only the ache in her ribs, the burning in her lungs, the slow realization that she was still alive. Behind the half-collapsed shed, under the broken slats of a roof that barely held together, 3 small figures huddled in the dark. Ellie, the eldest at 6, held baby June against her chest, whispering the lullabies her mother used to sing before the shouting started. Rose, 4 years old, whimpered softly, too afraid to cry. The blanket they clutched was soaked through, their little boots filling with mud. They watched the shape of their mother through the rain, too scared to move closer, too young to understand why no one came to help, because no one ever did. The Haskins farm sat 3 miles outside of town, far enough for neighbors to claim they didn't hear the screams. Folks knew what Earl was like, mean when drunk, meaner when sober, but they said it wasn't their place to meddle in another man's household. The preacher had once come by after hearing rumors, but Earl met him at the gate with a shotgun and a sneer. "Bible says a man rules his home," he'd spat, and the preacher had left without another word. Now Clara lay half-conscious in the mud, rainwater pooling in her hair, thinking maybe that preacher was right. Maybe this was what she'd earned, for being weak, for failing to give her husband what he wanted. She wanted to move, to crawl back to her girls, but her body refused to obey. Every breath stabbed like a knife between her ribs. Somewhere, the baby began to wail again, the sound slicing through the thunder like a plea for mercy. Clara tried to answer, but only a rasp came out. "Shh, Mama," Ellie whispered, crawling closer on her hands and knees. "We're here. Don't cry, Mama." Clara's vision blurred. She saw her daughter's little face, streaked with dirt and rain, and her heart broke clean in 2. She tried to smile, tried to tell her she was sorry, that everything would be all right, but she didn't have the strength. The world dimmed around the edges, the thunder grew distant, and her last thought before the darkness took her was that maybe dying wasn't the worst thing. Maybe it would mean her girls could be free. But the world wasn't done with Clara May yet, because far beyond the ridge, under the same storm-torn sky, a wagon rolled across the plain, its driver a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Jonas McCrae heading home from town. He didn't yet know that before the rain ceased, he'd find a woman and 3 little girls in the mud, and that saving them would change his life forever. The storm eased sometime after dawn, leaving the land washed clean but heavy with silence. Mist drifted over the fields where the crops had failed months ago, curling around the sagging fences like tired ghosts. The Haskins yard looked more like a ruin than a home, muddy, broken, and still. A raven perched on the fence post, its feathers slick with rain. Somewhere beneath the gray haze, a woman still lay half buried in the muck, and 3 small girls waited for someone who would never come back. That someone, by a twist of mercy, came anyway. Jonas McCrae drove his wagon down the muddy road, his hat pulled low and his coat collar turned up against the drizzle. He was a man who didn't waste words or glances. Life on the frontier had taught him that silence was often safer than conversation. His reputation in town was simple, steady, fair, quiet. Some called him the Giant, though he wasn't just tall. It was the way he carried himself, like a mountain that couldn't be moved. He'd left his ranch before dawn to buy feed and salt in town, but the washed-out road forced him to take the long way home. As he passed the Haskins place, something caught his eye. A bit of movement near the barn, small and uncertain. He slowed his horse and looked closer. What he saw made him set the reins down and climb off the wagon without thinking. 3 children, barefoot, soaked to the bone and staring at him with the wide, hollow eyes of creatures too young to understand despair. Jonas knelt down in the mud, his hat dripping. "You girls all right?" he asked softly. The oldest, a little thing with tangled hair and a stubborn chin, held her baby sister tighter and shook her head. "Mama's hurt," she said in a voice so small it nearly broke him. Jonas followed the child's gaze and saw her. She lay half hidden behind a rain barrel, her dress torn, her face a patchwork of bruises and blood. For a moment he thought she was dead. Then her chest moved, just barely. Jonas didn't ask what happened. The story was written plain enough on her body. Without a word, he took off his coat, knelt beside her, and lifted her into his arms. Clara stirred, her voice a whisper of pain. "No, please, I can't go." "You're going," he said quietly. "You and your girls?" The oldest stepped forward, clutching his sleeve. "Sir, he'll come back. He'll be mad if he—" Jonas looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "He won't touch you again." The simple certainty in his tone silenced even the storm itself. He carried Clara to the wagon, laying her gently in the bed of it. The girls climbed in beside her, curling against their mother's sides. Jonas covered them with a blanket, the same one he used for his horses on cold nights. Then he climbed up, took the reins, and turned the wagon toward the rising sun. For miles, no one spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the wheels and the soft crying of the baby. At one point, the horse stumbled in the mud, and the little girl beside him, Ellie, gasped, clutching the wagon seat. Jonas reached down, steadying her with a big hand. "It's all right," he said. "Ain't far now." The road stretched wide and lonely before them, leading toward the McCrae Ranch, a place the townsfolk called the last good land before the desert. Behind them, the Haskins place faded into the mist, swallowed by the storm's quiet aftermath. Clara, half conscious under the blanket, felt the rhythm of the wagon wheels beneath her and the strange warmth of the man's coat around her shoulders. For the first time in years, no one was shouting. No one was hitting. There was only the steady heartbeat of a horse, the sound of rain easing, and a man's calm voice telling her she was safe. She didn't believe it yet. But deep inside, something small flickered, a fragile, impossible thing she hadn't dared to feel in years. The rain had stopped, but the world was still gray and heavy as Jonas McCrae guided his wagon along the muddy trail that wound toward his ranch. The land stretched wide and empty on either side, flat plains scattered with mesquite and sagebrush, the kind of country that seemed to test whether a person had the grit to stay alive in it. The wagon wheels creaked and hissed through puddles, each turn slow and deliberate, as though the land itself didn't trust a stranger's haste. In the wagon bed, Clara May drifted in and out of consciousness. When she opened her eyes, she saw the sky, pale and washed clean now, and her 3 girls curled up beside her beneath a horse blanket that smelled faintly of leather and pine smoke. The oldest, Ellie, sat upright, alert and wary, as if she'd decided the safety of her sisters depended on her small shoulders. Rose, her thumb tucked in her mouth, leaned against her mother's arm, while baby June slept in the crook of Clara's elbow, her breathing soft and steady. Clara tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her lips cracked. "Where?" she managed. Jonas's deep voice came from the driver's seat ahead. "On the road to McCrae Ranch. Half a day's ride yet." His tone was steady, almost casual. But his eyes, when he turned briefly to check on her, carried something else, quiet worry, and a patience that made Clara feel strangely unworthy. "You shouldn't," she began, but the words failed her. She meant to tell him he shouldn't have stopped, shouldn't have taken her, shouldn't risk the trouble. Men didn't interfere in another man's household out here. But he only said, "Rest. Talk later." She closed her eyes again, her body swaying with the rhythm of the wagon. In the haze of half-sleep, memories crept in. The sound of Earl's voice, the crack of his belt, the neighbor's shutters closing when she screamed. Her heart began to race, panic clawing at her chest, but then she felt it, the wagon slowing, the crunch of boots in mud. Jonas's shadow fell across her as he crouched down beside the wagon. He offered her a tin cup. "Try a sip. Water's cool from the creek." Her hand trembled as she took it. He waited, saying nothing, his gaze steady. When she finished, he reached into a satchel and pulled out a small tin, opening it with a practiced thumb. "Honey and milk," he said simply. Then he dipped a clean rag into it and held it toward the baby, who whimpered softly in her sleep. With careful gentleness that seemed almost out of place on a man built like him, Jonas let a few drops touch the baby's lips. Little June stirred, then began to suckle weakly. It was such a small thing, yet Clara's breath caught in her throat. No man had ever done something so kind without wanting something in return. Ellie watched him closely. Her little face creased with suspicion. "You gonna hurt Mama?" she asked suddenly. Jonas met her eyes, grave and honest. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "Not ever." Something in the way he said it, like a promise carved from oak, eased the fear in the girl's face. She turned, tucked the blanket around her sisters, and lay back down, her hand still gripping her mother's sleeve. As the wagon rolled on, the land began to change. The scrub gave way to gentle hills, and in the distance the outline of a sturdy ranch house came into view, broad, weathered wood, smoke rising from the chimney. Behind it stretched a corral, a barn, and far-off pastures where horses moved like dark shadows against the light. When Jonas finally spoke again, his voice was almost tender. "That's home," he said. "Ain't fancy, but it's safe." For the first time in years, Clara didn't doubt those words. The wagon slowed, the horses snorted, and as Jonas jumped down to open the gate, the wind carried the scent of fresh hay and rain-washed earth. Clara's eyes filled with tears she didn't understand. She was still broken, still afraid, but something deep inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different, a place where the shouting had stopped, a place where her girls might laugh again, a place where she could learn what it meant to be unafraid. When Clara next woke, sunlight slanted through lace curtains, casting soft patterns across the quilt that covered her. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The air smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke, not whiskey and sweat. She listened, no shouting, no boots stomping across a floor, no crash of dishes, only quiet. Then the sound of children's laughter drifted in from somewhere beyond the doorway. Small, uncertain giggles that she hadn't heard in months. Her ribs ached. Her head throbbed, but she pushed herself up on one elbow and blinked around the room. The walls were paneled wood, clean and sturdy. A window overlooked a fenced corral where the morning light painted everything gold. On the bedside table sat a pitcher of water and a small folded note written in a heavy, square hand. "Doctor's been by. You'll heal. Rest. J.M." She touched the letters like they were something holy. A soft creak drew her gaze to the door. A round woman with graying hair and kind eyes stepped in carrying a tray. "Well, you're awake," she said, smiling. "Good. Thought I'd have to pour broth through your nose to get something in you." Clara blinked, startled, her instinct to apologize rising before she even spoke. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to—" "Hush," the woman said, setting the tray down. "Name's Martha, housekeeper here. You're at the McCrae Ranch, and you've not a thing to apologize for. Man brought you and your girls in half dead from that wreck of a farm. You're safe now." The words "you're safe" made something twist inside Clara's chest. Safe was a word that never seemed meant for her. But Martha's tone left no room for doubt. For days, Clara drifted between waking and sleep. Martha came and went, spooning broth into her mouth, checking her bandages, clucking over the children. The girls, though shy, soon found their way under Martha's wing, helping her peel potatoes or feed the chickens. From the window, Clara could sometimes see Jonas McCrae in the distance, working with the horses or mending a fence, broad-shouldered, quiet, moving with the steadiness of someone who never needed to prove his strength. When he entered the room one evening, she felt the air change. He carried a small wooden cradle in his arms, handmade, the joints smooth, the edges sanded fine. Without saying a word, he set it beside her bed and placed baby June inside. "I can't," she started, her voice trembling. "You've already done too much." He straightened, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Ain't right for a baby to sleep on the floor," he said simply. That was all. No pity, no soft words, just truth, plain and unvarnished. Then he tipped his hat and left. In the quiet that followed, Clara felt something she hadn't felt since she was a girl in her father's kitchen. Respect. Not for what she could give, or how she looked, or what she could endure, but simply for existing. As the days turned to weeks, her strength returned. She began helping around the house, insisting on washing dishes or mending clothes despite Martha's protests. She found small comfort in work. It gave her purpose again. The children began to laugh freely, chasing the ranch dog through the yard, their bare feet kicking up dust. Sometimes Jonas watched from the porch, a faint smile ghosting his lips, and Clara would feel warmth she couldn't name. But under that peace lay a thin, trembling fear. Earl would come. He always came. He'd never let go of the only thing he thought he owned. Some nights, Clara woke in a sweat, the memory of his boots creaking on floorboards echoing in her head. She would reach for her girls, touch their warm cheeks, and whisper to herself, "He can't find us here." But she didn't quite believe it. Not yet. Jonas, though he said little, seemed to understand. When she flinched at loud noises, he spoke softer. When she worked too hard, he found tasks to occupy her girls so she could rest. He never asked about her past, never demanded gratitude. Only once, when he caught her staring at the horizon, did he speak the words that steadied her heart. "Whatever hurt you before, Clara May, it stops here." For the first time, she wanted to believe him. The summer air grew thick and restless on the plains, the kind that made the horizon shimmer and tempers fray. For weeks, the McCrae Ranch had known peace, work, laughter, and quiet evenings filled with the chirp of crickets. Clara almost let herself believe the nightmare was over. She'd begun walking further from the house, helping Martha hang laundry, even humming when she thought no one could hear. The girls slept through the night without waking in fear. For a while, it almost felt like a life reborn, but the past never forgets. That evening, the sky turned strange. Clouds bruised the sunset, and the wind picked up from the east. Jonas stood on the porch, hat low, watching the line of dust twisting along the far ridge. At first, he thought it was a stray horse or one of his men coming in late. Then he saw the glint of metal, spurs, and a shape slouched in the saddle. His gut tightened. When the rider drew closer, Jonas saw the mean slope of his shoulders, the bottle hanging from his belt, the ugly smirk that spread across his face as he recognized the ranch house, Earl Haskins. Jonas didn't move until the man dismounted, swaggering up the path with the confidence of a rattlesnake. "Well now," Earl slurred, "looks like my woman's been enjoying herself while I've been gone." He spat in the dirt, eyes scanning the yard. "Heard you was hiding her, McCrae. That true?" Jonas's jaw tightened. "They ain't hiding. They're safe. That's the truth of it," Earl laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Safe? Ain't no man makes safe what belongs to another. You best hand her over. She's mine by law, and them girls too." From inside the house, Clara froze. She'd been shelling beans by the window, and the sound of that voice, the voice that haunted her sleep, struck her like a whip. Her breath caught, her heart hammering in her chest. She could see him through the glass now, standing there like a dark memory made flesh. The girls were playing on the floor. Ellie looked up at her mother, confused. "Mama, what's wrong?" Clara couldn't answer. Her hands shook so violently the bowl slipped from her fingers, scattering beans across the floor. Outside, Jonas stepped off the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the dirt. He was calm, almost unnaturally so. "You best turn that horse around, Haskins. Ain't nothing for you here." Earl's grin widened. "You threatening me, boy?" "I don't threaten," Jonas said, his voice low and even. "I warn." Earl took a step closer, whiskey glinting on his breath. "You think you can take what's mine? Some half-dead woman and her brats?" His hand twitched toward the knife on his belt. "You don't know who you're messing with." Jonas's eyes darkened. He'd seen men like Earl before, bullies who thought pain made them powerful. He didn't move until Earl lunged forward. Then the world snapped into motion. It was over in seconds. Jonas caught Earl's wrist mid-swing, twisted it hard, and with one solid punch sent him sprawling into the dust. The knife clattered beside him. Jonas stood over him, fists clenched but steady, chest rising with slow, controlled breaths. "You ever come near them again," he said quietly, "you'll ride away in a pine box." Earl spat blood, his pride more wounded than his jaw. "You'll pay for this," he hissed, staggering to his feet. But when he saw the shotgun resting against the porch rail, Martha's hand steady on it, he hesitated. Jonas didn't need to say another word. Earl backed away, mounting his horse with a curse and a glare that promised revenge. When he rode off into the fading light, Clara collapsed to her knees inside the house. Tears poured down her face, her body shaking. The girls clung to her, frightened but unharmed. Jonas stepped into the doorway a few moments later, silent. He removed his hat, his eyes full of something between anger and pity. "He's gone," he said softly. "He won't touch you again." But both of them knew the truth. Men like Earl didn't give up so easy. Still, that night, as the wind died and the ranch grew quiet again, Clara looked at Jonas and realized something had changed forever. She was no longer alone in her fear. Someone had stood between her and the darkness, and for the first time she believed maybe she deserved to be protected. The days after Earl's visit were heavy with silence. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the echo of hooves that, thankfully, never came again. For the first time in years, Clara May slept through the night without jerking awake at every creak of the floorboards. Still, when the wind rattled the shutters, her hand would shoot out instinctively to pull her girls close. It took time, long, patient time, for her body to understand that the danger was gone. But Jonas McCrae never brought it up again. He didn't mention the fight, or the bruise that had colored his knuckles, or the way the sheriff had later confirmed Earl had been run out of town after picking another drunken brawl. Jonas simply went back to work as if nothing had happened, repairing fences, tending cattle, moving through his days with that same quiet steadiness that had first saved her life, and that, more than anything, helped Clara heal. It wasn't the grand gestures or the words. Jonas wasn't a man of many. It was the small things. A steady cup of coffee left waiting on the table each morning, tools fixed before she even noticed they were broken, the way he always slowed his steps when one of her daughters ran across the yard, so he wouldn't scare them. The ranch itself seemed to breathe easier, too. Martha hummed again while cooking, her laughter filling the kitchen. The children began to explore the wide fields, Ellie chasing chickens, Rose picking wildflowers, baby June toddling after them like a little shadow. The sound of their giggles followed Clara wherever she went, and each one chipped away a piece of the darkness that had clung to her for years. One afternoon, Clara stood by the clothesline, hanging laundry in the warm breeze. Her hands were stronger now. The color had returned to her cheeks. She watched her girls roll in the grass, their laughter ringing out against the open sky. For the first time in years, she smiled without guilt. Jonas rode in from the pasture then, his shirt damp with sweat, his hat tipped low. He dismounted and led his horse to the trough. When he noticed her watching, he paused, uncertain. "You look better," he said simply, wiping his brow with his sleeve. Clara blushed, glancing away. "It's your doing. You gave us a home." He shook his head. "You made it one." The words struck deep, quiet, and honest. She didn't know how to answer. He started to turn away, but then he hesitated, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small carved figure, a little wooden horse. Rough-hewn but sturdy. "Made this for Ellie," he said. "She keeps talking about wanting to ride someday." Clara took it in her hand, the wood still warm from his palm. "She'll love it," she murmured, but her throat tightened. For a long moment, neither spoke. The breeze rustled through the grass, the sun dipping low behind the hills. Clara realized she hadn't felt this kind of silence before, not the fearful kind, but the gentle kind that lived between two people who didn't need to fill it with words. That evening, they all ate together for the first time, Jonas, Martha, Clara, and the girls. The table was full of noise, laughter, spilled milk, Rose talking too loud, baby June slapping her spoon. Jonas barely said a word, but every now and then, his gaze drifted toward Clara, lingering not out of want, but of quiet respect. Later, as Clara tucked her daughters into bed, Ellie whispered, "Mama, are we going to stay here forever?" Clara's heart swelled. She brushed the girl's hair back and kissed her forehead. "If Mr. McCrae lets us," she said softly. Across the hall, Jonas stood by the open window, listening to the night wind sweep across his land. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Storms always came. One way or another, but for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't known he was missing. A home, and it wasn't just his anymore. It was theirs. By autumn, the McCrae Ranch had found its rhythm. Mornings came with the sound of roosters and children's laughter. Evenings ended with firelight and quiet talk. The girls had grown sun-browned and free, chasing calves through the corral, filling the house with songs they learned from Martha. To anyone who stepped through that front door, it looked like a home filled with peace. But peace has a way of stirring envy in those who've never known it. Word began to spread in town. First as murmurs, then as sharp whispers. Folks at the mercantile spoke in lowered voices when Clara walked in for supplies. Women who'd once turned their faces away from her bruises now turned their backs for different reasons. "She's living up there with him," one said, eyes wide with mock pity. 3 little girls and no ring on her finger. "Imagine the example she's setting. I heard he's sweet on her," another replied. Took her in without question. Can't be right. A man doing that without wanting something. By the time the story reached the saloon, it had grown thorns. Men laughed and made crude jokes over whiskey, twisting kindness into something dirty. The word charity turned to sin before it left their lips. Clara heard it first from Martha, who returned from town tight-lipped and red-faced. "You ought to know what they're saying," she muttered, slamming down a sack of flour. "Bunch of fools thinking the worst of a man who's done nothing but good." Clara's hands froze on the dough she was kneading. "They're talking about me," she said quietly. Martha hesitated, then nodded. "They don't matter, but you should know." That night, Clara sat by the window long after the children had gone to bed. The lamp's glow touched her face as she stared out across the moonlit fields. It wasn't just shame that burned inside her, it was fear. Fear that she was a burden again, that her presence would stain Jonas's name the way her husband had once ruined hers. She remembered Earl's words, hissed in her ear after every beating. "You're lucky I keep you, woman. No one else would want what's used up and worthless." Now sitting in that quiet, she almost believed him again. When she heard footsteps on the porch, she startled. Jonas stood there, the glow of the lamp catching the lines of his face. "You look troubled," he said gently. She tried to smile. "I think it's time we left, Mr. McCrae, the girls and me. You've done more than enough," he frowned. "You planning to go where?" I don't know. Maybe south. Maybe work for someone who needs help in their kitchen. I can't stay and bring shame on you." Jonas stepped inside, boots quiet against the wood. "Shame," he repeated, voice low. "That what folks are saying?" She couldn't meet his eyes. "It don't matter. It's what they think." Jonas stood for a moment, his gaze heavy but calm. "Clara May, I don't live my life by what town gossips think. And you don't owe this world an apology just for surviving it." Her lip trembled. "You don't understand." "I do," he interrupted softly. "I seen what the world does to people who don't fit its rules. But I won't have you or those girls walk out that door thinking you ain't worth the air you breathe. You stay because you belong here. Nothing more to it." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was steady, like the ground after a storm. Clara's eyes filled, tears spilling unchecked. "Why are you so kind to me?" she whispered. Jonas's answer was simple. "Because someone ought to be." For the first time, she didn't argue. She just nodded and let herself cry. The next morning, when she went into town for supplies, she held her head a little higher. The whispers still followed her, but they didn't stick like before. Maybe kindness didn't need defending. Maybe it just needed to keep existing. Quiet, steady, and stubborn as the man who'd given her a reason to believe in it again. Winter had begun to loosen its grip when the fire came. It started as a faint orange glow far out on the horizon, just another prairie blaze, the kind that ranchers kept an eye on but never feared too much. But by the time Jonas noticed the wind shifting that afternoon, the air had already turned sharp with smoke. He was out mending fence posts when he caught the first whiff, burnt sage and dry grass. Looking up, he saw the sky darkening in the west, the wind carrying a low, angry roar. "God help us," he muttered, dropping his tools and sprinting for his horse. Back at the ranch, Clara was hanging laundry, humming softly while the girls played by the barn. She didn't notice the danger until the chickens began to screech and scatter. When she looked up, her breath caught. The horizon wasn't blue anymore. It was red. Martha came running from the house, apron flapping. "Fire! Coming fast!" she shouted, voice shaking. Clara froze for only a heartbeat. Then instinct took over. She grabbed baby June from the grass, shouting for Ellie and Rose to run inside. The wind had turned wild now, whipping dust and ash across the yard. When Jonas thundered into the yard moments later, his horse lathered and snorting. The fire was already close enough to feel the heat against his face. "Get the girls in the wagon," he barked, jumping down. "We'll head east toward the creek bed." "It's our best shot!" Clara obeyed without question. Her hands shook as she lifted the children into the wagon, their frightened cries nearly drowned by the rising wind. Jonas threw a tarp over the supplies, then ran for the barn. "Jonas!" she called. "Leave it, we have to go." But he didn't stop. The cattle were trapped inside the corral. If they panicked and ran toward the flames, the loss would destroy everything. Jonas swung open the gates, shouting and waving his arms until the herd bolted in the opposite direction toward the low hills. Only when he was sure they were clear did he climb onto the wagon seat. "Hold tight!" he yelled. The horses lunged forward, wheels jolting over rocks and ruts. Smoke rolled across the plains like a living thing, swallowing everything behind them. Clara clutched June to her chest. The other girls pressed against her sides, coughing and crying. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Behind them, the house, her home, was just a shape in the smoke. She wanted to look back but couldn't bear to. "Keep your head down," Jonas shouted, his voice raw. "We're almost there." They reached the creek bed just as the fire roared across the ridge. Jonas jumped down and yanked the tarp loose, throwing it over the wagon as he pulled Clara and the girls beneath it. The flames swept past them in a blinding rush of heat and light, the sound like the tearing of the earth itself. Clara held her children close, whispering prayers she barely remembered. For a long, terrible moment, there was only fire, then silence. When the smoke began to thin, Jonas pushed the tarp aside. The world was gray and still. Blackened grass stretched as far as the eye could see. The ranch house was gone. Nothing left but the faint outline of where it had stood. Clara stared at it, tears cutting clean streaks through the soot on her face. "It's all gone," she whispered. Jonas turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Not all," he said quietly. "You're here." "The girls are here?" "That's enough." She looked at him then, really looked. The soot on his skin, the torn shirt, the steadiness in his eyes, and something inside her broke, but not from pain, from gratitude. Because for the first time in her life, she realized that home wasn't a place built of wood or stone. It was made of hands that held fast when the world burned, and Jonas McCrae's hand was the one still holding hers. The first morning after the fire was eerily quiet. The plains, once golden and alive, had turned into a sea of gray ash stretching endlessly in every direction. Smoke still drifted from the blackened earth, curling into the pale dawn like ghosts refusing to leave. Clara stood beside the wagon, the girls still sleeping inside, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and horses. The wind was cold, biting against her skin, but she didn't move. She just stared at the horizon where the ranch had once stood. Her heart felt hollow, like the land itself. Jonas approached from the creek bed where he'd been checking the horses. His shirt was torn, his hat lost to the flames, and soot still streaked his face. But his eyes were steady, focused. "They'll hold," he said, nodding toward the team. "Strong stock. We can make town by sundown. Clara turned to him slowly. And after that? She asked. Her voice was soft, trembling. He hesitated. After that, we rebuild. She almost laughed, bitter. Tired laughter, but when she met his gaze, there was something in it that stopped her. Determination. Not the kind born of pride, but of purpose. You'd rebuild. All of it? She whispered. After losing everything? Jonas shook his head. Didn't lose everything, he said simply, glancing toward the sleeping children. That's what makes starting again worth it. His words sank deep, echoing in the hollow spaces of her heart. The journey back to town was long and slow. The wagon creaked, the horses' hooves crunching over charred ground. Along the way, they passed other ranchers, men and women leading their animals, faces blackened with soot, eyes wide with disbelief. The fire hadn't spared anyone. When they reached town, the people who had once gossiped about Clara now looked at her differently. Not with disdain this time, but pity and perhaps shame. The preacher offered shelter in the church, and Mrs. Porter from the bakery brought soup for the children. Clara thanked them quietly, though part of her still struggled to accept kindness without fear of what it might cost later. Jonas, meanwhile, wasted no time. He spent the following days helping neighbors dig trenches, mend fences, and salvage whatever supplies could be found. When he finally came back one evening, covered in dirt and sweat, Clara met him at the church steps. "You've been helping everyone," she said softly. "You haven't eaten, haven't slept." He shrugged, setting down a bundle of tools. "Ain't right sitting still when folks got nothing." "But you got nothing, too," she said, almost pleading. He looked at her then, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Got you all, don't I?" Clara's breath caught. It wasn't a declaration, it was a truth spoken simply without demand. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear, the shame, the weight of her past. They didn't vanish, but they loosened their hold. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like someone's burden. She felt wanted, needed. The next morning, she woke before dawn. Instead of lying still, she rose and found Jonas by the wagon, sorting through what tools they had left. "If we're rebuilding," she said, "you'll need someone to keep the books and feed the hands." He looked up at her, brow furrowed. "You sure about that?" She smiled, small but certain. "I'm not going anywhere, Jonas McCrae. Not anymore." His answering nod was wordless but full of meaning. Together, they set out for what had once been the McCrae Ranch. The air was still heavy with smoke, but the sky above it was clear, a pale, determined blue. When they reached the land, it was hard to look at. The barn, the corral, the house, all gone. But Clara didn't cry this time. She stood there beside Jonas, holding June on her hip, her other daughters clinging to her skirts, and she felt something new. Hope. Jonas picked up a blackened board, turning it over in his hands. "This land's still good," he said quietly. "We'll start here." And as the wind moved across the plains, carrying the faint scent of rain and renewal, Clara realized that what they'd lost could be built again, not with wood or stone, but with faith, courage, and the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. Spring came slowly that year, as if the earth itself needed time to heal. The charred plains began to show threads of green, tiny shoots pushing through black soil. Every sunrise brought a little more color back to the land, and a little more strength back to those who called it home. Jonas and Clara worked side by side from dawn to dusk. Together they rebuilt the fences, mended the well, and raised a small cabin on the same ground where the old ranch house had stood. It wasn't much. 4 walls, a roof that creaked when the wind blew, but to Clara, it was a castle. The girls played in the fields again, their laughter mixing with the sound of hammers and saws. Martha returned to help, bringing with her a basket of bread and a scolding tongue. "You two are working yourselves half to death," she muttered, though the softness in her eyes betrayed her affection. But it was in the quiet moments, after the day's work was done, that something deeper began to settle between Clara and Jonas. One evening, Clara sat by the porch, mending a tear in one of the girls' dresses. The sun had dipped low, painting the sky gold and rose. Jonas came up from the barn, washing his hands at the pump before joining her. For a long while they didn't speak. The air between them was easy, familiar. "You ever think you'd end up here?" Jonas asked at last. She smiled faintly. "I never thought I'd end up anywhere," she admitted. "Not after—" Her words faltered, memories flickering through her mind. Earl's fists, the loneliness, the fear. Jonas didn't press her. He just nodded, his gaze distant. "Ain't much of a talker, you know that," he said. "But when you and those girls came this place, hell, I started feeling alive again." Clara set down her needle, her throat tightening. "You saved us," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, Clara May, you saved me." The words hung between them, simple but heavy with truth. She looked up at him then, really seeing him, the man who'd carried her from ruin, who'd given her and her daughters not just shelter, but dignity. And in his eyes, she saw something that had been growing for months, love, deep and steady as the land itself. But before she could speak, a small voice piped up from the doorway. "Mama, Mr. McCrae, come look! Fireflies!" They both turned. The girls were running barefoot through the grass, their laughter rising with the evening air. Tiny sparks of light danced around them, blinking like little stars fallen to earth. Jonas smiled. "Guess the world's starting to heal." Clara rose, standing beside him. "So are we." He looked down at her then, the last light of day glinting in his eyes. Slowly he reached out his hand, not the calloused, commanding gesture of a man giving orders, but a quiet offer. Clara hesitated only for a heartbeat. Then she took it. It wasn't the kind of touch that burned or trembled. It was solid, sure, and full of everything they'd endured together. Years of pain, loss, and survival melted into that single moment of peace. When she looked up at him, Jonas smiled, just a little. "Guess it's time I stopped calling you Mrs. Harlan," he said softly. "If you'll let me?" Her breath caught. "What would you call me then?" "Clara McCrae," he said simply. The world seemed to still. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain. Clara's eyes filled with tears, not from sorrow, but from a quiet joy she'd never dared to imagine. "Yes," she whispered. "I'd like that very much." And as the first stars blinked awake in the endless Texas sky, Jonas McCrae pulled her close, not as a savior and the saved, not as a rancher and a widow, but as two souls who had found home at last, in each other's keeping.